I didn't go to the baby shower because I cared about balloons or cake or the forced cheer of people pretending diapers are a miracle. I went because my ex-girlfriend Mara was going to be there, and I wanted to see if the rumors were true, or if I was just losing my grip on reality after 6 months of silence and blocked numbers. The shower was for her brother and his wife, held in their backyard, one of those suburban spaces engineered to look casual while screaming money. And I stood near the drink table pretending to scroll my phone while clocking everything. The pastel decorations, the awkward games, the way people kept glancing at Mara like she was a celebrity who hadn't announced her project yet. She looked different, not glowing, not miserable, just sharper somehow, like she'd decided to be untouchable, and her husband, Evan, hovered near her shoulder with that nervous devotion men have when they think they've won something rare. I hadn't spoken to Evan more than twice in my life, but I knew his face too well because it used to stare back at me in the mirror at 3 a.m. when I wondered how easy it was for someone else to step into my life and take over the future I thought was locked in. When the games wrapped up and the gifts were stacked like trophies, Mara's brother clinked his glass and thanked everyone for coming, and that should have been the end of it. But then Mara stood up without being asked, one hand on her stomach, smiling like she was about to drop a harmless joke, and said she wanted to share something special since everyone was already gathered. The air shifted, even the kids went quiet. She announced the baby's name, clearly, confidently, like it had been confirmed by the universe, and people lost their minds, clapping and cooing and congratulating her, even though this wasn't her event, even though you could see her sister-in-law's smile stiffen for half a second before snapping back into place. I felt something hot and immediate crawl up my spine. Not jealousy exactly, more like recognition, because I knew that name, had known it for years, had said it out loud late at night when we talked about a future that apparently only one of us thought was real. She didn't look at me when she said it, but she didn't have to. The name itself was a message, and it landed. Evan wrapped an arm around her, proud and clueless, and that's when the noise in my head got loud enough that I couldn't pretend anymore. See, the part no one at that party knew, the part Mara had begged me to bury when she left, was that the timeline didn't work, that the dates overlapped in a way that couldn't be explained by stress or bad math, that the last night we spent together before she needed space was etched into my memory because it felt like an ending, not a beginning. I'd done the counting, over and over, in denial and then in anger, and I'd confronted her once, quietly, with no witnesses, and she cried and said I was imagining things and asked me to let her go. Standing there with plastic cups sweating in my hand, watching her soak up attention meant for someone else, I realized she hadn't just moved on, she'd rewritten the story and cast me as a footnote she never had to acknowledge. I should have left. Any reasonable person would have left. Instead, I watched Evan laugh with her brother, watched him talk about nursery colors and sleep schedules like his life was already mapped out, and something snapped cleanly. Not in a dramatic way, just a quiet decision settling in. I didn't raise my voice or make a scene. I waited until people drifted back to their conversations, until Evan stepped away from Mara to grab another drink, and then I walked up to him like a guy about to comment on the weather. I said his name, he smiled, and I told him we needed to talk because there was something about the baby he deserved to know, and as his expression shifted from polite curiosity to confusion, I understood that whatever happened next was going to burn everything to the ground, and part of me was done pretending I cared. Evan followed me to the side yard where the music thinned out and the conversations blurred into background noise, and I remember noticing stupid details like a tipped-over planter and a half-deflated balloon, because my brain was stalling, giving me one last chance to shut up and walk away, but I didn't take it. He asked what was going on, still calm, still friendly, like this was about a parking issue or a joke he'd missed, and I told him I wasn't here to start drama, which was a lie, but a useful one, and that I wouldn't say this unless I was sure, which was also a lie, depending on how you define sure. I said the baby wasn't his. I didn't dress it up, didn't ease him into it, just dropped it between us and watched his face freeze. Not explode, not crack, just stall, like a computer processing bad input. He laughed once, short and confused, and asked if this was some kind of messed up prank, and I said no, that I dated Mara right up until the window where the pregnancy would have happened, that the math didn't work no matter how generous you were, and that I'd kept quiet because she asked me to, but seeing her announce the name like she was stealing oxygen finally broke whatever agreement I thought we had. He asked why I was doing this now, and I told him the truth for once, that I didn't plan to, that I showed up out of curiosity and left with clarity, and that if I were him, I'd want to know before building a life on a lie. His hands started shaking then, subtle but there, and he kept asking for specifics, like dates and weeks and how sure I was, and I answered as cleanly as I could without turning it into a confession or a plea. I didn't tell him I still thought about her, or that the name felt like a knife. I stuck to facts, because facts feel safer even when they blow everything up. He went quiet for a long time, staring at the grass, and I thought for a second he might punch me or call me a liar or walk straight back and confront her, but instead he asked if anyone else knew. I said no. He nodded like that mattered. When he finally walked back toward the party, his shoulders were different, like someone had adjusted the gravity just for him, and I stood there feeling empty rather than satisfied, which surprised me more than anything. I didn't leave right away because I'm apparently bad at self-preservation, so I drifted to the edge of the yard and watched the slow unravel begin in real time. Evan didn't confront Mara publicly. He tried to talk to her quietly, leaning in, his mouth tight, and at first she smiled like she always did when she thought she was in control, but then something in his tone shifted and her face drained, not dramatically, just enough that if you were looking, you'd see it. She shook her head hard, whispered something sharp, grabbed his arm, and he pulled away. People started noticing then that something was off, that the energy had turned sour, and conversations dipped and stalled like bad reception. Her brother walked over, confused, protective, asking what was going on, and Evan said something I couldn't hear that made Mara snap, actually snap, her voice rising just enough to slice through the music. She denied it loudly, said I was obsessed, said I was trying to ruin her happiness, and for a split second I wondered if she'd get away with it, if the sheer confidence of denial would carry her through like it always had. But Evan wasn't yelling. He was too calm, asking her to swear, to explain the dates, to tell him why she'd lied about when she found out she was pregnant, and that calm scared people more than shouting would have. Her sister-in-law started crying, not even about the baby anymore, just overwhelmed and angry that her event had been hijacked in a way no apology could fix. Someone's aunt tried to intervene, telling everyone to take a breath, and that only made it worse. Mara locked eyes with me across the yard then, real hatred there, not the curated indifference she'd perfected, and in that moment I knew she'd never forgive me, not that forgiveness was on the table anymore. Evan walked out without saying another word, keys in hand, leaving her standing there exposed in front of family who suddenly didn't know which version of her to believe, and the party dissolved into clusters of whispering adults and crying kids, while she sank into a chair like the weight had finally caught up. I left after that, slipping out without ceremony, my phone buzzing before I even reached my car, and as I sat there with the engine off, reading Evan's first text asking for proof, I realized this wasn't over, not even close. It had just shifted from a moment into a mess that was going to drag all of us down with it. Evan's text sat on my screen longer than it should have, because once you start providing proof, you're no longer the guy who dropped a truth bomb and walked away. You're a participant, and I wasn't sure which role I hated more. He asked for dates, messages, anything concrete, and I told him I had texts and photos, but not the kind that screams scandal, just enough to show we were together when she claimed we weren't, enough to make the timeline impossible to ignore. I drove home with my phone lighting up every few minutes, Evan asking careful questions like he was disarming a bomb, and Mara sending messages that swung wildly between rage and desperation, accusing me of being bitter, then begging me to stop before I ruined everything. I didn't answer her. I sent Evan screenshots instead, not out of spite, but because once you open a door like that, you don't get to decide how far it swings. He thanked me in a way that felt rehearsed, like he was trying to stay polite because that was the only thing he still controlled, and then he went quiet for hours. In that silence, I replayed the last year of my life with an intensity that bordered on self-punishment. Every argument with Mara, every time she brushed off a question or changed a detail, every moment I'd ignored because love makes you stupid and hopeful in equal measure. Around midnight, my phone rang, and it was Evan, his voice racked but steady, asking if I was willing to meet him the next day because he didn't want to do this alone, and he didn't trust anyone else to tell him the truth. We met at a diner off the highway, neutral ground with bad coffee and fluorescent lighting that made everything look harsher than it already was, and he looked like he hadn't slept at all, eyes red, jaw clenched like he'd been chewing on this for hours. He laid out what happened after I left, how he confronted Mara again at home, how she denied it until he showed her the screenshots I'd sent, how she broke down and admitted she wasn't sure, but insisted it didn't matter because he was the one who'd be there, because biology was just a detail she didn't think he needed to obsess over. Saying it out loud like that finally cracked him. He slammed his fist on the table hard enough to rattle the silverware, and asked how someone could make that decision for another person and still call it love. I didn't have an answer. He asked if I wanted to be involved if a paternity test happened, and I said no, not because I was scared of the result, because I didn't want to be tied to her life any more than I already was. But he said my name was already in this whether I liked it or not. Word traveled fast after that, faster than either of us expected, because families are ecosystems and secrets are invasive species. Mara's brother called me furious and confused, accusing me of sabotaging his wife's baby shower out of jealousy, and I told him the same thing I told Evan, that the timing didn't work and that I hadn't planned any of it, and he hung up without saying goodbye. Friends I hadn't spoken to in months suddenly had opinions, some telling me I did the right thing, others saying I should have kept my mouth shut and let them sort it out privately, like privacy was still an option once the lie was that big. Mara finally cornered me in person 2 days later in the parking lot of my apartment, showing up unannounced, eyes wild, demanding to know what I wanted, what my endgame was. And when I said there wasn't one, that I just wanted the truth out, she laughed like that was the most insulting thing I could have said. She told me Evan might forgive her, but he'd never trust her again, and that if the baby wasn't his, she'd have to live with that fallout forever. And she asked if that was really worth whatever satisfaction I got from tearing her down. I told her she'd torn herself down the moment she decided other people didn't deserve the truth, and for a second she looked genuinely scared, not of me, but of what was coming next. The test happened quietly, no announcement, no social media drama, just a sealed envelope that Evan asked me to be present for when he opened it, because he said he needed someone who wouldn't lie to his face. I stood there in his living room, hands in my pockets, heart pounding like I was the one on trial, and when he read the result, his face didn't change at first. Then it collapsed in a way I won't forget, and he said, very softly, that the baby wasn't his. That should have been the end of my involvement, the moment where I stepped back into anonymity, but instead it was the point where everything escalated, because truth doesn't clean up messes, it just shows you how big they really are. The fallout didn't explode all at once. It seeped into everything like a slow leak you can't locate, and Evan unraveling was quieter than I expected, less yelling and more hollow spaces where his life used to make sense. He didn't kick Mara out immediately, which confused people who heard fragments of the story and assumed betrayal always comes with slammed doors, but instead he slept on the couch and walked around like he was touring a museum of his own bad decisions. He told her he needed time, and she interpreted that as hope, clinging to routines like cooking dinner and talking about doctor appointments, as if repetition could overwrite reality. I tried to step back like I'd promised myself, but Evan kept reaching out, not for comfort exactly, more like confirmation that what he was seeing was real and that he wasn't insane for feeling detached from the person he married. He asked questions that had no satisfying answers, whether I ever suspected she'd lie this far, whether she talked about him when she was with me, whether I thought she felt guilty, and every time I said I didn't know, it frustrated him more than if I'd lied. Meanwhile, Mara went on the offensive, not publicly at first, but strategically, contacting mutual friends and family members with her version of events, framing the pregnancy as a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by two men with bruised egos. Some people bought it because it was easier to believe she'd made a mistake than to accept she'd constructed a lie sturdy enough to hold a marriage together. Others didn't, and those were the ones she cut off without hesitation, including her brother, whose baby shower had become a landmark moment he now wished he could erase. He stopped returning her calls, and the silence from him hurt her more than any accusation, because it wasn't loud enough to fight. Evan moved out a week later, not dramatically, just a few bags and his laptop, saying he needed distance to think, and she cried like it was the first time the consequences felt real. She tried to call me that night, left a voicemail accusing me of enjoying this, of sitting back while her life collapsed, and I deleted it without listening to the end, not out of strength, but exhaustion. People started treating me differently, like I was radioactive or heroic, depending on which version they'd heard, and I hated both reactions because neither felt accurate. I hadn't acted out of principle or malice, so much as a breaking point I didn't plan for. Evan asked me to come with him to see a lawyer, not to speak, just to sit there, and I did, watching him absorb words like annulment, separation, and custody arrangements that felt surreal given the circumstances. The lawyer talked about timelines and options, and Evan stared at the table like it might offer guidance, while I wondered how many lives quietly derail in offices like that every day. Mara didn't show up to the first appointment with her own lawyer. She sent a message saying she needed time to process, and that everything was moving too fast, which sounded absurd coming from someone who'd controlled the pace of the truth for months. She posted on social media anyway, knowing people would read into it, vague quotes about strength and forgiveness, photos cropped to avoid showing she was alone, and the comments filled with support from people who didn't know or didn't want to. Evan stopped looking at her profiles after that, asked me to block her on his phone because he didn't trust himself not to respond, and that request hit harder than anything else because it meant he saw me as a safeguard against his own weakness. One afternoon, her parents showed up at my door without warning, polite but strained, asking why I couldn't have handled this privately, why I'd chosen to humiliate their daughter, and I told them I hadn't chosen anything except not lying when confronted. Her mother cried, said Mara was scared and alone, and for a moment I felt like a villain in someone else's story, until I remembered how many choices led to this point that had nothing to do with me. The paternity result didn't make things cleaner, it made them heavier, turning what could have been a clean separation into a moral debate people felt entitled to weigh in on. Evan eventually told Mara he wanted a divorce, not angrily, just firmly, and she accused him of abandoning her when she needed him most, ignoring the fact that she'd decided his role without consent. When he told me afterward, his voice steady for the first time in weeks, I realized this wasn't about revenge or justice anymore. It was about watching two people deal with the consequences of a story they couldn't keep straight. I thought that would be the point where my involvement finally faded out, where I could return to being a bystander to my own life. But the truth has a way of dragging witnesses back in, and the next thing that happened made it clear Mara wasn't done rewriting the narrative, with me in it. Mara didn't accept the divorce quietly. She pivoted, recalculated, and decided that if she couldn't control the outcome, she'd control the story. And that's when my name started showing up in places it had no business being. It began subtly with comments to mutual friends that I'd been unstable after the breakup, that I'd misremembered timelines, that Evan and I had fed each other paranoia until it felt like truth, and then it escalated into posts and messages implying I'd manipulated him during a vulnerable moment. I found out the hard way when a coworker asked, carefully, if everything was okay at home, and I realized whispers had traveled farther than I thought. Evan called me furious one night, not at me, but at the situation, saying she'd told her parents I'd fabricated evidence, that I'd photoshopped messages and coerced him into demanding a paternity test, and that they were considering legal options because I'd interfered with her marriage. Hearing that flipped a switch I didn't know I still had. It wasn't fear so much as a cold clarity that she was willing to burn anything if it kept her from standing alone in the wreckage. I told Evan to save everything, every message, every voicemail, every post, and he said he already was, because trust, once shattered, turns people into archivists. She tried to contact me again, this time measured and almost professional, asking if we could clear the air and present a united front to calm things down, and I laughed out loud reading it because the audacity was almost impressive. I told her no, that I wouldn't lie to protect her, and she responded with a warning about consequences, vague enough to be deniable but sharp enough to land. For a few days nothing happened, and I almost let myself believe she'd run out of moves, but then a letter arrived from a lawyer accusing me of defamation and emotional distress, citing my conversation with Evan at the baby shower as malicious interference. It was ridiculous on paper, but effective in practice, because suddenly I was spending nights rereading my own memories, wondering how easily truth could be twisted into liability if someone had enough money and rage. I showed the letter to Evan, and he promised he'd testify if it came to that he'd own his decisions publicly if needed, and that loyalty meant more to me than I expected after everything. Mara's brother reached out then, quietly apologetic, saying he'd finally seen the messages himself and realized how deep the deception went, and he told me his relationship with his sister was effectively over, not because of the baby, but because she'd refused to stop lying even when the damage was obvious. That admission felt hollow, a victory that didn't taste like anything, because families don't break cleanly, they fray. The lawyer's threat didn't turn into a lawsuit, but it served its purpose, rattling me enough that I started documenting my own life like evidence, saving receipts, writing down dates, preparing for a fight I didn't want. Evan moved forward with the divorce paperwork, and Mara reacted by reaching out to him again, cycling between apologies and accusations, sometimes in the same message, telling him she loved him and that he was cruel for abandoning her, that he'd promised forever, and forever shouldn't be conditional. He didn't respond, but he forwarded everything to me, asking if I thought he was doing the right thing, and I said yes, even though right feels abstract when everyone involved is hurting. The baby shower incident became shorthand in our circle, the moment everyone pointed to as the beginning of the end, and I hated that because it reduced months of deception and denial into a single dramatic snapshot. Mara stopped posting for a while, then resurfaced with a long message about healing and accountability that never actually acknowledged what she'd done, only that she was learning and growing through hardship, and the comments flooded with encouragement from people who still didn't know the full story. Evan told me he was moving to another state for a fresh start once the divorce finalized, that he couldn't stay where every street reminded him of a life built on false assumptions, and hearing that made everything feel final in a way the paternity test hadn't. As for me, I realized I'd been living in reaction mode for months, tethered to a story I didn't choose, and I started to feel the weight of that more than the anger. I thought the worst of it was behind us, that the legal scare and social fallout were the last waves, but then Mara did something I didn't anticipate at all, something that pulled me back into the center of the mess and forced me to confront a truth I'd been avoiding since the beginning. Mara showed up at my apartment again, but this time she wasn't angry or calculated or pretending to be in control. She looked smaller, like the fight had leaped out of her, and that scared me more than any threat she'd made before. She didn't call or text first, just knocked until I opened the door, and the moment I saw her face, I knew this wasn't about the lawsuit nonsense or reputation management. She walked past me without waiting to be invited in, sat on the edge of the couch like she was afraid to get comfortable, and said she needed to tell me something before it was too late, which is a sentence that never leads anywhere good. I told her she had 5 minutes, and she nodded like she expected that, hands shaking as she twisted them together, and then she said she wasn't sure I was the only possible father. That landed heavier than everything else combined, because up until that moment, part of me had still been bracing for responsibility, for the possibility that all of this chaos would circle back and anchor itself to me permanently. She explained in fragments, not excuses exactly, more like confessions stripped of any attempt to look good, admitting there had been someone else during a brief stretch when she and I were figuring things out, someone she'd written off as irrelevant because the timing felt safer if she ignored it. She said she'd convinced herself the baby was Evan's because that version of reality was survivable, because admitting uncertainty would have meant losing everything before it even started. I asked her why she was telling me now, and she said because Evan was gone. The divorce was moving forward, and the lies weren't protecting her anymore, just rotting whatever was left. She said she hadn't done the math properly at first because she hadn't wanted to, and hearing that made something in me go numb, because it meant this wasn't a tragic misunderstanding, it was deliberate avoidance dressed up as hope. I told her I didn't want to know anything else, that whatever she was carrying was hers to deal with, but she kept talking anyway, saying she needed to know if I'd support another test, not legally or emotionally, just the truth on paper, and that question felt obscene after everything we'd already burned through. I said no, not because I was afraid of the answer, but because I refused to be a tool she used to stabilize herself when things got hard. She cried then, real tears, saying she was scared of doing this alone and that she never meant to hurt anyone, and I almost laughed at that, because intention stops mattering once the damage is layered this deep. I told her to leave, and this time she did without arguing, pausing at the door like she wanted to say more, and then thinking better of it. After she left, I sat in the dark longer than I'd like to admit, realizing how close I'd come to tying my future to a story built entirely on avoidance, and that realization felt both freeing and brutal. Evan called later that night, saying Mara had emailed him a long confession that contradicted half the things she'd sworn to before, and he asked if she'd contacted me too, and when I said yes, there was a long silence before he thanked me for being honest again. He said he felt stupid for mourning a version of his life that never really existed, and I told him stupidity had nothing to do with trusting someone you loved. He moved up his relocation plans after that, said he needed physical distance before emotional distance could even begin, and we talked less after that, not out of bitterness, but because some connections serve their purpose and then fade. The lawyer letter quietly disappeared, replaced by nothing, which was almost worse because it meant Mara had finally realized threats wouldn't save her. People stopped asking me questions, the gossip cycle moving on to fresher disasters, and for the first time in months, I wasn't reacting to someone else's mess. Still, sleep didn't come easy, because my mind kept circling the same thought, that I'd spent so long being angry at Mara for lying, that I hadn't fully confronted how close I'd come to accepting a responsibility that wasn't mine just because it felt familiar. I started therapy around then, not because I felt broken, but because I didn't trust my instincts anymore, and the therapist said something that stuck with me, that betrayal doesn't just hurt because of what was done, but because it forces you to rewrite your understanding of yourself. By the time I heard through mutuals that Mara was preparing to move back in with her parents, isolated and quietly panicking about the future, I didn't feel satisfaction or pity, just a dull acceptance that this was the shape of the aftermath. I thought that chapter was finally closing, that the worst truths were out in the open, but I underestimated how long consequences echo, and how one last reveal can change the meaning of everything that came before. I thought distance would dull the edges of everything, that once Mara moved back with her parents and Evan disappeared into a new city, the story would lose momentum and I'd finally get my life back. But consequences don't fade just because the main characters exit the frame. A month after Mara left town, I got a call from an unfamiliar number, and I almost ignored it until the voicemail came through. A woman's voice, controlled but tight, introducing herself as the other man's wife. That phrase alone reset my pulse. She said she'd gotten my name from Mara after pressing for the truth, that she didn't want drama or revenge, just confirmation, and hearing that told me everything about how far the truth had traveled and how much collateral damage was still spreading outward. We met at a coffee shop that felt too public for the conversation we were about to have, and she arrived early, notebook on the table, like she was preparing for a deposition. She told me her husband had admitted to the affair weeks earlier after Mara reached out to him in a panic, trying to figure out timelines now that everything else had collapsed, and that the admission had cracked open a marriage she thought was solid. She didn't cry or raise her voice. She asked questions the way someone does when emotion has already burned through and left clarity behind. And I answered honestly, because at that point, honesty was the only currency left. She said the paternity test Evan took had forced her husband to confront the possibility that the baby could be his, and that he'd been living in denial because acknowledging it would have meant accepting responsibility for more than just infidelity. Hearing that made my stomach drop, not because it involved me directly, but because it confirmed that Mara's avoidance had detonated lives she wasn't even facing. The woman thanked me for telling Evan the truth at the baby shower, said it was cruel in the moment but necessary in the long run, and that comment stayed with me because it echoed something I'd been afraid to articulate. A week later, I learned through the same quiet channels that another paternity test had been done, this time involving the other man, and that the baby was his. There was no announcement, no dramatic confrontation, just a quiet shift in the narrative that explained everything retroactively. The panic, the threats, the lies stacked on top of each other to delay the inevitable. When I heard, I didn't feel relief or vindication, just a strange sadness for how avoidable all of this had been if someone had chosen discomfort early instead of catastrophe later. Mara didn't contact me after that, and I didn't expect her to. Her silence felt like an admission she couldn't phrase without collapsing completely. Evan texted once more, weeks after he'd moved, telling me he'd finalized the divorce and that he was doing better than he thought he would, that the clarity hurt, but it was clean, and that he hoped I was finding the same. I told him I was trying, and that was the truth, even if progress felt uneven. The story stopped being about Mara for me then, and started being about the aftermath I carried. How easily I doubted myself, how long I'd tolerated half-answers because they were easier than conflict, how close I'd come to letting someone else's chaos define my future. People still occasionally asked if I regretted saying something at the baby shower, framing it like a moral puzzle, and I always gave the same answer. I regretted that it happened at all, but not that the truth came out. Regret implies choice, and by that point, silence would have been its own decision, with consequences just as real. Life slowly normalized in ways that felt unfamiliar. Quieter evenings, fewer buzzing notifications, less adrenaline masking his purpose. And in that quiet, I realized how loud my anger had been, how it had filled space I didn't know what to do with once it was gone. I didn't walk away feeling like a hero or a villain, just someone who learned the hard way that being honest doesn't make you immune to damage, it just changes who you're accountable to. By the time the baby was born, news I heard secondhand, stripped of names and photos, I felt detached enough to acknowledge the fact without spiraling, and that detachment felt like progress, even if it came with a hint of emptiness. I thought that was the end of the story, the final ripple settling. But stories like this don't really end cleanly, they just stop being loud. And the last part is learning how to live without the noise. The quiet after everything settled wasn't peaceful the way people promise it will be. It was disorienting, like stepping off a treadmill you didn't realize was moving that fast. And I spent weeks waiting for the next hit even when there was nothing left to fall apart. I went to work, saw friends, pretended I was back to normal, but the truth was, my sense of cause and effect felt warped. Like I'd learned too clearly how one moment of honesty can ricochet through dozens of lives and still not land anywhere satisfying. Therapy helped in small, irritating ways, naming patterns, unpacking why I'd tolerated Mara's half-truths longer than I should have, recognizing how much of my identity had been wrapped up in being the reasonable one. But insight didn't erase the lingering sense that I'd been standing too close to a controlled burn. Then, just when the story had faded enough to feel archived, I got another message, this time from Mara's mother, asking if we could talk. Not confrontational, just tired. We met in a quiet park, and she looked older than the last time I'd seen her, grief aging her in subtle ways, and she thanked me for coming like I'd done her a favor. She didn't defend her daughter or accuse me of anything. Instead, she told me Mara had been struggling in ways she hadn't admitted to before. Panic attacks, insomnia, an overwhelming fear that she'd ruined her life beyond repair, and that hearing that filled me with a complicated mix of empathy and distance. Her mother said something that stuck with me, that Mara kept saying if she'd just told the truth earlier, everything would still be broken, but at least it would have been honest. And hearing that felt like a quiet echo of everything I'd been trying to articulate since the shower. I didn't offer comfort or absolution, I just listened, because sometimes listening is the only thing that doesn't make things worse. After that conversation, I realized how badly I wanted closure I wasn't entitled to, some neat emotional resolution that would justify the chaos, and accepting that I wouldn't get it was its own kind of progress. I stopped checking for updates, stopped asking mutuals indirect questions, and started making decisions that had nothing to do with damage control, like applying for a job I'd been putting off and planning a move I'd talked myself out of for years. The story became something people referenced in past tense, a cautionary anecdote rather than an active wound, and when someone new asked about my last relationship, I learned to summarize it without reopening everything, which felt like a skill I hadn't known I'd need. One night, months later, I got a message from a number I didn't recognize, just a short line saying, "I don't expect a response, but I'm sorry." And I knew immediately it was Mara. I stared at it longer than I should have, weighing whether responding would help either of us or just reopen a door that was finally closed. And in the end, I didn't reply. Not out of cruelty, but because apologies don't always need an audience to be real. I deleted the message and felt a strange sense of relief, like choosing silence that wasn't forced this time. Life kept moving in small, ordinary ways, and that ordinariness felt earned rather than empty, a return to scale after months of emotional inflation. I thought about Evan occasionally, wondered how his new life was shaping up, hoped he'd found something steady and unremarkable in the best way, and I hoped the baby, innocent in all of this, would grow up surrounded by adults who'd learned something from the wreckage. If there was a lesson I carried forward, it wasn't about revenge or timing or even truth in the abstract. It was about recognizing when silence stops being neutral and becomes a choice that protects the wrong things. The story didn't give me catharsis or moral clarity, just a deeper respect for how fragile narratives are and how easily people confuse comfort with honesty. By the time I stopped thinking about the baby shower with that spike of adrenaline, I knew I'd crossed some invisible line from survival into acceptance, and even if the scars were still there, they no longer defined the shape of my days. I didn't realize how much the whole thing had rewired my instincts until I started dating again and caught myself bracing for deception where there was none, scanning for inconsistencies like it was a reflex instead of a response. Every harmless delay in a text, every vague answer, every shift in tone felt loaded until I forced myself to stop and remember that not everyone communicates in fragments because they're hiding something. That hypervigilance was the last thing the story left me with, and it was harder to shake than the anger had been. I talked about it in therapy, about how betrayal doesn't end when the liar disappears. It lingers in the person who had to learn the truth the hard way, and naming it helped, even if it didn't immediately fix it. Around that time, I ran into Mara's brother at a grocery store, the kind of accidental meeting that feels staged even when it isn't, and we stood there awkwardly between the produce and frozen foods before he finally said my name. He looked tired, but calmer, like someone who'd grieved and moved into acceptance, and he told me he'd had his baby a few weeks earlier, that becoming a parent had rearranged his priorities in ways he didn't expect. He apologized for blaming me early on, said it had been easier than facing what his sister had done, and I told him I understood, because I did, because blame is a shortcut when the truth feels too big to process. We didn't talk about Mara much, just acknowledged that she was still struggling, still figuring out what came next, and then we went our separate ways, that brief exchange closing a loop I didn't know was still open. I moved cities not long after, not dramatically, just far enough that familiar streets didn't trigger familiar memories, and the distance helped more than I expected. New routines gave my days shape again, and the story slowly lost its power to define me, becoming something I'd lived through rather than something I was still living inside. Occasionally, someone would recognize a detail and ask if I was the guy from that situation, and I learned to shrug it off, because being known for surviving chaos is still being known for chaos, and I wanted to be known for quieter things. One night, months into the new chapter, I got an email from Evan, longer than his last message, saying he'd started dating someone kind and uncomplicated, that he'd learned what red flags actually look like when you stop romanticizing them, and that he was grateful, genuinely grateful that I'd spoken up, even though it had detonated his life. Reading that brought a sense of closure I hadn't expected, not because it validated my actions, but because it confirmed that honesty, even when messy, had allowed him to rebuild something real. I replied wishing him well, and meant it, and when I closed my laptop, I realized that was the last time I'd felt pulled back into the story emotionally. The baby shower, once this explosive moment frozen in my mind, started to feel distant, like a scene from someone else's life I'd watched too closely. I stopped rehearsing what I could have said differently, stopped wondering if timing would have changed anything, because the truth is, timing only determines the size of the blast, not whether it happens. What stuck with me most wasn't Mara's betrayal or Evan's heartbreak, but how quickly a single decision can ripple outward, how many people end up carrying pieces of something they never consented to. I learned that telling the truth doesn't guarantee gratitude or peace, but it does give you something solid to stand on when everything else shifts. As life settled into something steady, I understood that the story didn't need a dramatic ending to be complete. It ended when it stopped teaching me new lessons, when it became a reference point instead of a wound. I didn't walk away untouched, but I walked away clearer, and that clarity felt like the only real resolution I was ever going to get. By the time a year had passed since that fateful baby shower, the edges of the chaos Mara had created had softened, not erased, but dulled by distance, perspective, and time. I'd moved into a smaller apartment across the city, one that didn't carry ghosts of arguments, tears, or frantic late-night phone calls. Even the apartment itself felt quieter than it should have. No echo of Mara's laughter, no frantic ringing of Evan's questions, no voicemail reminders of threats or confessions. I realized I'd been living for months in a state of suspended anticipation, expecting another bombshell, another text, another confrontation that never came. In the beginning, the adrenaline from those moments had disguised exhaustion. Now, in the absence of chaos, I could finally feel how tired I had been, how drained I had allowed myself to become by other people's lies and deceptions. I spent mornings making coffee, listening to music I hadn't dared to enjoy without guilt, taking walks around the neighborhood without scanning for someone from my past, and these ordinary actions started to feel revolutionary. The phone calls stopped, the emails dwindled to nothing, and for the first time, the story existed entirely in memory, messy, tangled, but safely behind a barrier I didn't have to cross anymore. I started dating again slowly, cautiously, aware of the reflexive suspicion that still lingered in my mind, but now tempered with experience. I discovered it wasn't about guarding against everyone, but about being honest with myself about what I could handle, what boundaries I needed, and what kind of life I wanted moving forward. One evening, months later, I ran into Evan again, this time at a cafe in the city neither of us had lived in a year ago. He was calmer, less haunted, more himself, and he introduced me to the woman he was seeing now, someone kind-eyed and grounded, whose presence alone made it clear Evan had found some measure of peace. We spoke quietly about the past, about lessons learned, about the futility of blame once the consequences had already landed. There was no anger left, no need for validation, just acknowledgement. We had been in the fire, we had survived, and somehow that alone counted as victory. Mara remained a ghost, occasionally mentioned by mutual acquaintances in tones of pity or quiet shock, but she no longer occupied my thoughts the way she had for months. Even when her name appeared in a headline or an old message thread, it registered almost like a footnote, a reminder of turbulence endured rather than a current storm. In those quiet moments, I realized the baby shower, the conversation that started the chain of revelations, the confrontation with Evan, the lawsuits, the ultimatums, had been less a turning point for her and more a turning point for me. It had forced me to see how fragile truth is when people manipulate it for comfort, how necessary boundaries are, and how much power there is in simply refusing to lie, even when doing so makes the moment worse. I understood that life doesn't always grant tidy endings, and sometimes the resolution isn't a climactic closure, but a slow reclamation of self. There would always be traces, social media snippets, overheard gossip, memories that surfaced unexpectedly, but they no longer dictated my emotional state. I had learned to compartmentalize, to live alongside the chaos without letting it define me. Looking back, I realized the real impact of the whole story wasn't Mara, Evan, or even the paternity drama. It was me. I had survived confrontation, lies, heartbreak, and the moral complexity of being the messenger in a story nobody wanted to face. And I had emerged still standing, still capable of forming relationships, still capable of trust. I had earned the ability to make decisions based on my own life, rather than being dragged by someone else's deceit. The final lesson was unglamorous but vital. Truth is messy, justice is imperfect, and consequences ripple far beyond intention. But living honestly, even when the timing is disastrous, even when everyone else suffers in the wake, is the only thing you can control. And control, however small, becomes a foundation for rebuilding. Sitting in my apartment, sipping the coffee I'd brewed for myself, watching sunlight fall through the blinds, I felt a quiet kind of victory. Not loud or triumphant, but steady and unshakable. The storm had passed, the dust settled, and I could finally exhale, knowing I had made it through intact, wiser, and free. The story of that baby shower, the lies, the confessions, and the broken trust, had ended not with fireworks or vengeance, but with something far rarer: survival, clarity, and the simple, profound knowledge that life could continue beyond the wreckage.